Willow Creek, Oklahoma. 1952. Margaret Collins smoothed her cotton dress as she sat across from her parents in their modest living room. At 23. She had always been the dutiful daughter, church every Sunday, top of her nursing class, engaged to the respectable son of her father's business partner. Until now. "I'm going to marry David Nighthawk," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Her mother's teacup clattered against its saucer. Her father's newspaper lowered slowly, revealing a face hardening into stone. "The Cherokee from the hospital?" Her mother whispered, as if speaking his heritage aloud was obscene. "He's a doctor, mother, chief resident in surgery." Her father stood abruptly. "This is absurd. You're engaged to Thomas Reynolds." "I've already told Thomas. He's set, but he understands." "Understands?" Her father's voice rose. "There's nothing to understand. You can't throw away your future. Your reputation or a reputation for some... some Indian." Margaret flinched at the venom in his voice but held her ground. "David is a respected physician. He served in Korea. I don't care if he's the Surgeon General." Her father slammed his hand on the side table. "No daughter of mine will marry an Indian. I forbid it." Margaret stood, facing her father, with the same determination that had carried her through medical school when most women were discouraged from such ambitions. "I'm not asking permission, Father. I'm informing you of my decision. The wedding is set for June." Her mother began to weep softly. "Think of what people will say, Margaret. Think of the children you might have. They'll never be accepted." "They'll be accepted by people who matter," Margaret replied, her voice softening. "David's family has welcomed me. His grandmother has offered to help with the ceremony." Her father's face reddened dangerously. "His family, you've been to? The reservation?" "It's not a reservation anymore, Father. They live in Cherokee Nation, and yes, I've visited many times." The revelation seemed to push her father beyond words. Pointed to the door, his hand trembling with rage. "Get out, if you choose him. You are no longer my daughter." Margaret had anticipated this reaction, but still felt the words like physical blows. She gathered her purse with shaking hands. "I love you both. When you're ready to meet David, to really know him, we'll be waiting." Her mother turned away, shoulders shaking with sobs. Her father remained rigid, his extended arm unwavering. As Margaret stepped onto the porch of her childhood home, she heard the door lock behind her with decisive finality. News spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. By morning, everyone knew Margaret Collins had broken her engagement to Thomas Reynolds to marry that Cherokee doctor from the county hospital. Walking into Doreen's diner for her usual Wednesday breakfast, Margaret immediately sensed the change. Conversations hushed as the bell above the door announced her arrival. If this story has stirred something in you, a sense of justice, of love, or simply humanity, pause for a moment, give this video a like, and hit subscribe to help us keep these forgotten voices alive. Eyes followed her to her regular booth by the window. Doreen herself, who had served Margaret pancakes every Wednesday since high school, approached with an uncharacteristic stiffness. "Just coffee today?" she asked, avoiding Margaret's eyes.
Yes.
"Pancakes too, please. Blueberry, if you have them." Doreen nodded curtly and retreated without her usual cheerful banter.
Hi.
From the counter, Margaret heard whispers that weren't meant to be quite so audible. "Can you imagine? After how the Reynolds have treated her family? My cousin married a quarter-blood Choctaw. Their kids look just ... wrong. Doctor or not, Indian blood is Indian blood." Margaret stared at her coffee, willing her hands not to shake. This was her hometown. These were people she'd known all her life. She'd delivered newspapers to their porches as a girl, babysat their children as a teenager, treated their illnesses as a nurse. A shadow fell across her table. She looked up to see Eliza Reynolds, Thomas's mother, glaring down at her. "You've humiliated my son," Eliza stated, her voice carrying in the now silent diner. "After everything our families have shared, you choose to throw yourself away on a savage." Margaret set down her coffee cup carefully. "Dr. Nighthawk is one of the most respected surgeons in the state, Mrs. Reynolds. There's nothing savage about him." "Pretty feathers don't change a crow's nature," Eliza snapped. You'll regret this decision when the novelty wears off and you realize what you've lost. When Margaret didn't respond, Eliza leaned closer. You think you're special? That you're teaching us all some lesson about equality? You're just another silly girl with exotic tastes? He'll tire of you once he's proven he can take a white woman from her rightful place. Before Margaret could reply, Eliza spat directly on the table in front of her, a glob of saliva landing inches from Margaret's plate. Gasps echoed through the diner, but no one intervened. You're dead to this town, Margaret Collins. Dead to all decent people. As Elisa stormed out, Doreen approached with a rag, silently wiping away the spittle without meeting Margaret's eyes. My pancakes? Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. Kitchen's backed up, Doreen replied stiffly. Might be a long wait. Understanding the unspoken message, Margaret placed $1 on the table and stood. No one spoke as she walked, out head held high despite the burning behind her eyes. In her car, safely alone, she finally allowed herself a moment of doubt. Was she strong enough for this? Could their love withstand such hatred? The answer came as she started the engine. She would drive straight to Cherokee Nation, to David. To the future they were building, one that had no room for the small-mindedness of Willow Creek. David Nighthawk's home sat on land his family had held since the forced relocation from Georgia over a century before. The modest house, surrounded by oak trees and gardens of traditional medicinal plants, represented the blending of worlds that defined David himself: modern medicine and ancient knowledge, Cherokee traditions and contemporary life. When Margaret arrived, eyes still red from crying, David was in the garden with his grandmother, gathering herbs for drying. One look at Margaret's face told him everything. They wouldn't listen, Margaret said simply. David embraced her, the scent of sage on his hands comforting as he stroked her hair. I'm sorry I had hoped... It doesn't matter, she insisted, though they both knew it did. We have each other. We have your family. See, her face mapped with 90. Years of wisdom and sorrow approached slowly. Though small in stature, her presence commanded respect. She took Margaret's hands in her weathered ones. The path that crosses worlds is never smooth, she said in accented English. But those who walk it bring new strength to both sides. Inside, over tea made from herbs from the garden, they discussed the wedding plans. The ceremony would blend Christian elements for Margaret with Cherokee traditions honoring David's heritage. There is something I must tell you, she said, as twilight gathered outside. I have spoken with the elders. They wish to offer a blessing for your union at sunrise on your wedding day. David looked surprised. The horseback blessing. That hasn't been performed in decades. T nodded solemnly. The elders believe this marriage deserves the ancient recognition. 12 will come, representing the 7 clans and the directions of power. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the honor. Why us? Surely there have been other mixed marriages in the nation. Yes, C agreed. But few where both parties stand with such respect in their communities. David heals bodies, you heal spirits with your kindness. Together, you bridge worlds that need healing. Later that night, as they sat on the porch swing, watching fireflies rise from the meadow, Margaret rested her head on David's shoulder. Do you ever regret choosing me? She asked quietly, knowing what it costs. David considered the question. With the thoughtfulness that had first drawn her to him, when I was a boy, my grandfather told me that a life without difficult choices is a life half-lived. He took her hand, tracing the engagement ring he had given her, a silver band inlaid with turquoise stones from his family's land. I choose you every day, Margaret, and I will choose you every day that follows. A car approached on the gravel driveway, headlights cutting through the darkness. Margaret tensed, wondering if her father had come to continue their argument. Instead, Dr. William Hayes, the hospital administrator, stepped out. His expression was grave as he approached the porch. David, Margaret, he nodded. I'm sorry to disturb your evening. What is it, Bill? David asked, rising to greet his colleague. Hayes looked uncomfortable. The hospital board held an emergency meeting today. There's been pressure from several prominent families in town. Margaret felt a cold dread. The Reynolds, Hayes nodded reluctantly. Among others, they're threatening to withdraw financial support unless... He trailed off, clearly pained by his mission. Unless what? David asked, though his rigid posture suggested he already knew. Unless you're removed from your position as chief resident, Hayes finished. Margaret started to speak, to insist she wouldn't allow him to sacrifice his position, but David raised his hand gently. Tell the board they'll have my decision tomorrow, he said calmly. And Bill, remember that some of those prominent families may need a Cherokee surgeon one day. I wonder if their principles will matter then. Ow. As Hayes drove away, Margaret and David returned to the porch swing, holding each other in the darkness. Ahead lay choices no couple should have to make, prejudices no love should have to overcome. But as C had said, the path that crosses worlds is never smooth. The question was whether their love was strong enough to walk it together, regardless of the cost. The hospital board meeting room felt impossibly small as David stood before the 12 members seated around the polished oak table. Through the window, he could see the hospital where he had saved countless lives, white, native, and everyone in between. Medicine didn't discriminate. People did. Dr. Nighthawk, Chairman Walters began, shuffling papers to avoid eye contact. We've reviewed your outstanding service record and contributions to this hospital. Then this meeting should be brief, David replied calmly. As my record speaks for itself. Uncomfortable glances circulated around the table. Dr. Hayes, who had delivered the ultimatum the night before, stared at his hands. The issue isn't your competence, Walters continued. It's a matter of community standards. The hospital relies on local support. You mean my engagement to Margaret Collins violates your community standards? David stated flatly. Walters cleared his throat. Several significant donors have expressed concerns about mixed marriages among our leadership staff. I see. David looked each board member in the eye, one by one. Some held his gaze, others looked away. May I remind the board that the hospital mission statement declares service to all people regardless of race, color, or creed. That applies to patients, Dr. Nighthawk. Staff relationships are a different matter. David nodded slowly. Then let me be clear about my position. I will not end my engagement to accommodate prejudice, no matter how financially beneficial that prejudice might be to this hospital. A female board member, Dr. Sarah Levinson, the only woman present, spoke up. Some of us believe this entire discussion is inappropriate and potentially illegal. Dr. Nighthawk's personal life is his own business. Thank you, Dr. Levinson, David acknowledged. But I want to address this directly. He placed a folder on the table. Inside is my formal response to the board's ultimatum. I will not resign my position. If you choose to dismiss me, I've included notice that the Cherokee Nation Legal Department is prepared to file a discrimination lawsuit. Murmurs rippled through the room. Walters opened the folder, face paling as he scanned the documents. Furthermore, David continued, I've contacted the American Medical Association Ethics Committee regarding this situation. They expressed significant interest, particularly given that several board members have patients among my fiancé's family. The threat was clear. This would not be a quiet local matter if they pursued it. We certainly don't want a legal battle, Walters backpedaled. Perhaps we've been hasty in addressing these ... concerns. I believe we have, Dr. Levinson agreed, pointedly. I move that we formally affirm Dr. Nighthawk's position and dismiss any discussion of his personal relationships as outside the board's purview. The vote wasn't unanimous, but it was sufficient. Secure, though he harbored no illusions about the resentment that would follow. Some battles were won, but the war against prejudice continued. Outside the hospital, Margaret waited in her car, knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. When David approached with a slight smile, she exhaled the breath she'd been holding. You're still chief resident, she said, reading his expression. For now, he confirmed, sliding into the passenger seat. But we've made enemies today. Margaret started the engine. We've had those since the day we met. Margaret stared at the letter in her hand, postmarked from her childhood home. After 6 weeks of silence from her parents, this thin envelope represented either reconciliation or final rejection. You don't have to open it now, David said gently. They sat in the garden behind his house, where wild flowers bloomed alongside traditional medicine plants. "Yes, I do," Margaret replied, breaking the seal before she could lose courage. The note inside was brief, written in her mother's precise handwriting. "Margaret, your father remains unmoved, but I cannot bear this separation. I will attend your wedding, though I cannot participate as we once planned. Perhaps, in time, hearts will soften." Mother, no words of blessing, no acceptance of David, but a small crack in the wall of rejection nonetheless. Margaret passed the note to David, who read it carefully. "This is a beginning," he said, "more than we expected." Before Margaret could respond, the sound of tires on gravel announced a visitor. They walked to the front of the house to find a surprising sight: Thomas Reynolds, Margaret's former fiancé, stepping out of his car, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Thomas," Margaret greeted him cautiously. "This is unexpected, I know. I probably should have called first." He nodded awkwardly to David. "Dr. Nighthawk." "Mr. Reynolds," David replied with professional courtesy. "Would you like to come inside?" Thomas shook his head. "This won't take long. I just... ... He faltered, then straightened his shoulders. "I came to apologize for my mother's behavior at the diner. It was inexcusable." Margaret blinked in surprise. "Thank you, Thomas." "That means a lot." "It doesn't change anything between us," Thomas clarified. "But what she did wasn't right. And the way the town is treating you isn't right either." He hesitated. "My sister Rachel asked me to give you this." He handed Margaret an envelope. Inside was a handwritten note and a newspaper clipping about a nurse in Tulsa who had married a Creek man and subsequently lost her job. Rachel's note read, "They tried to fire her, but the new hospital across town hired her immediately. If Willow Creek becomes unbearable, you have options. Not everyone thinks like my mother. Rachel always admired you," Thomas explained. "Applying to nursing school next year." As Thomas prepared to leave, he paused. "I won't be at the wedding. Not that evolved yet, but I hope. ... He searched for words. "I hope people surprise you in good ways, not just bad ones." After he departed, Margaret and David sat in stunned silence. "Well," David finally said, "as my grandmother would say, even the hardest stone can be shaped by enough drops of water." The next day brought another surprise. Dr. Sarah Levinson, who had defended David at the board meeting, arrived with her husband. Rabbi Levinson from the small synagogue in the neighboring town. "We know something about being outsiders," Sarah explained over tea in David's living room. "When we moved here from New York 15 years ago, someone painted swastikas on our front door." "How terrible!" Margaret gasped. "Yes, but then something unexpected happened," Rabbi Levinson continued. "3 local churches organized volunteers to repaint our house. People we'd never met brought food and welcomed us." "Communities are complex," Sarah added. "The loudest voices, the ones spewing hate, often seem to represent everyone. But there are always quiet allies waiting to be found." Before leaving, they handed David an envelope. "The hospital staff took up a collection for your wedding gift," Sarah explained. "Not everyone signed the card for obvious reasons, but more contributed than you might expect." That evening, as word spread of Thomas's visit and the Levinson support, the phone began to ring. A nurse who worked with Margaret offered to help with wedding preparations. The patient David had treated the previous year called to ask if he could play violin at the ceremony. The owner of the local photography studio, who had initially refused their business, reconsidered and offered a discount. "What's happening?" Margaret wondered aloud after the 5th call. David smiled thoughtfully. "I think people are choosing sides, and not everyone is choosing hate." With 2 weeks until the wedding, preparations intensified. The ceremony would take place on a meadow near David's home, where there was space for both the traditional Cherokee blessing and the more conventional service that would follow. Margaret had just finished a dress fitting with David's cousin, who had skillfully incorporated both Western and Cherokee design elements into her wedding gown when she spotted a familiar car approaching. Her heart lurched as she recognized her father's Buick. George Collins stepped out, looking uncomfortable. They moved to a shaded area where chairs had been arranged for the elder legates who would attend the ceremony. No one spoke until they were seated, the silence heavy with years of expectations and recent disappointments. Reynolds Mercantile is closing, George finally said. Thomas's father is bankrupt. The news shocked Margaret. Reynolds Mercantile had been Willow Creek's largest store for generations, and her father's construction company had relied on their business partnership for decades. I'm sorry to hear that, she said cautiously. But what does that have to do with me? The bank is calling in loans, including mine. George stared at his hands. With C's help, he wrapped it around both Margaret and David, binding them together. What is joined by choice and blessed by wisdom, let no one tear asunder, he proclaimed, first in Cherokee, then in English. As the final words echoed across the meadow, a sound drew Margaret's attention to the road leading to the property. A single car approached her father's Buick. George Collins stood awkwardly at the edge of the meadow, watching the end of the blessing ceremony. He wore his Sunday suit, his expression unreadable as the riders circled Margaret and David one final time before departing toward the hills. Margaret, still wrapped in the ceremonial blanket with David, felt her heart racing. At her father, come to object, to cause a scene? The peaceful beauty of the morning felt suddenly fragile. As the last rider disappeared into the trees, George approached slowly. Elizabeth emerged from the small crowd of witnesses who had gathered for the blessing, moving to her husband's side with a mixture of surprise and cautious hope. You came, she said simply. George nodded stiffly, his eyes fixed on Margaret and the Cherokee blanket that bound her to David. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, with visible effort, George extended his hand toward David. Dr. Nighthawk, he said formally. David, careful not to disturb the blanket, reached out to accept the handshake. Mr. Collins, we're glad you're here. George cleared his throat. I can't say I understand this. He gestured vaguely at the meadow, the retreating elders, the ceremonial blanket. But I couldn't miss my only daughter's wedding day. Margaret felt tears threatening. Thank you, Father. Don't thank me yet, George said gruffly. I'm still adjusting to all this. But your mother helped me see that I was choosing pride over family, and that's no choice at all. C, who had been watching quietly, stepped forward. The hardest journey is the one from the head to the heart, she said, her ancient eyes studying George with surprising compassion. You've taken the first step today. The formal wedding ceremony that followed later that morning blended traditions as seamlessly as the couple themselves had bridged their worlds. Margaret wore her grandmother's pearls with her wedding gown, which featured subtle beadwork and Cherokee patterns. David wore a black suit with a bolo tie adorned with turquoise from his family's land. Reverend Mills from Margaret's childhood. Church performed the Christian portions of the ceremony, while C and the eldest rider from the morning blessing represented Cherokee traditions. Guests from both communities filled the rows of chairs, hospital colleagues, Cherokee relatives, and a surprising number of townspeople from Willow Creek who had chosen acceptance over prejudice. Eliza Reynolds was noticeably absent, but Thomas and his sister Rachel sat in the back row, their presence a quiet statement of reconciliation. After the vows were exchanged and the couple pronounced husband and wife, George Collins surprised everyone by requesting to speak. He stood before the gathered witnesses, his discomfort evident, but his resolve clear. When Margaret told us about her engagement, I reacted with anger and fear, he admitted. I was wrong. This morning, I witnessed something I never expected. To see a ceremony of dignity and beauty that honored traditions older than our town, older than our state. He turned to the newlyweds. Margaret, David, I ask your forgiveness for my blindness. I offer my blessing, however belated it may be. The reception that followed became a living demonstration of cultures and harmony. Cherokee drums accompanied traditional square dancing. The feast featured both Southern comfort food and Cherokee dishes. Children from both communities played together, oblivious to the boundaries their parents and grandparents had spent lifetimes maintaining. As evening approached, David led Margaret to a quiet spot overlooking the property, where they could watch their guests continuing the celebration. Do you think it will last? Margaret asked, leaning against her husband's shoulder. This feeling of unity? David considered the question seriously, not perfectly. There will always be those who cling to division, the Eliza Reynolds of the world. Days like today create ripples that spread beyond what we can see. He pointed to where George Collins sat deep in conversation with one of David's uncles, both men gesturing animatedly as they discussed construction techniques. Sometimes the smallest openings create the greatest transformations, David said. Your father may never fully embrace our world, but he's found a doorway into it. Margaret thought of the morning blessing, of 12 elders on horseback, bearing witness to possibilities many had thought impossible. The elders knew, she said. That's why they performed the blessing. Not just for us, but for everyone watching. As the sun set over the celebration, painting the sky in brilliant orange, would you have stood by her side when the world turned away? Leave a comment below. We read every single one. And if this story moved you, like and subscribe to No Filter America, where the stories they tried to bury rise again.